So the big question we're going to ask today is, will vintage tubes improve your tone? This is something I've wanted to test out on the channel for a very long time, so super happy we can do it today. Let's jump straight in. Now, we as guitarists are always trying to find the perfect combination between guitar, pickup set, amp, etc. On and on it goes. But today we're going to be focusing on amplifiers and specifically tubes. So we're going to do a shootout between modern tubes versus a few sets of vintage tubes, and we're going to see if it makes a big difference. Now, first things first, I've got to give a massive shout out to John from Fuzz Audio. I was chatting with him about retubing my Blue Angel amp, which is the amp I rely on for my Fender type tones. And he knew exactly which tubes to recommend. Super knowledgeable. And not only that, he sent me a couple different sets of vintage tubes to try out. So I couldn't do this comparison without him. So big thanks to John. I'll link to the guys from Fuzz Audio in the video description below. But let's start off with the power tubes. So we've got two RCA 6v6 GTs. So these are kind of like the classic tubes found in a lot of Fender amps, Supros, anything kind of that would take a 6v6. So these RCAs were made in the USA from 1940 to the early 60s. So this is what we're going to plug in. And of course, I've already recorded some stock tones with the modern tubes. We're going to throw these power tubes in and see if it makes a difference. Now, to go along with the power tubes, we need some preamp tubes, and we're going to test two different sets. Set number one are these GE long plates. These are known as great affordable vintage tubes. You don't pay much more than you would for a modern 12AX7, which is fantastic. Made in the 50s and 60s. Basically a great, clean, bluesy breakup to classic rock option. So that's option number one. And option number two are the big daddies. These are like the holy grails. These are the RCA black plate 12AX7s. They're very expensive at like $100 a pop. Found in Fender amps in the 50s, made up into the 60s, and yeah, just are that prototypical Fender tone. You know, clean, clear, and full with lots of low end and break up really nice. So there you go. We're going to test, first of all, the power tubes with the GEs and then the power tubes with the RCAs. For today's video, we're going to be using a Fender American Stratocaster and a Gibson Les Paul Studio. The first two audio comparisons are going to be totally clean and use the Strat. Then we're going to crank up the volume on the amp, no pedals. We're just going to crank the amp until the tubes break up and use the Gibson for some of that classic tube breakup tone. Here we go. Let's get started. All right, now let's have some fun and see how these tubes break up. There is no master volume on this amp, so we got to take our main volume. We're going to crank it up to about 3/4 until these tubes are just rocking. Let's see how that sounds. So after listening back to those clips, here are my initial thoughts. Then we'll go ahead and do a quick Marshall comparison. But on the Fender side, well, the stock tubes sounded great. I've used that amp for years and loved it. It's warm, it's full, it's balanced, but wanting a more traditional Fender tone, well, the tubes did it, especially listening back through my studio monitors. Suddenly some of those heavy mid-range frequencies were not there. You still had lots of kind of like beautiful low end, not as many mids, and just sparkly highs that the stock tubes didn't have. And that's kind of the hallmark of a Fender tone, right? Lots of bass, lots of sparkly highs, not as many mids. And those vintage tubes definitely delivered on that. Obviously the EQ was kept the same, the gain stage, all that stuff was identical. All I did is swap out the tubes. That goes without saying. And then when we step up to the RCAs, especially when we did that chording change where I just did a simple chord back and forth for each one, you could really notice a difference. And when we plugged in the RCAs, well, they had even more chime than the GEs, and to my ear, a lot more overtones too. So they had a more complex tone as you moved along. Those RCAs are crazy expensive, but they sound amazing. Tons of shimmery highs, lots of overtones. I think for the price, the GEs are probably the way to go. But if you have the money and you're looking for that, you know, iconic Fender 50s and 60s tone, those RCAs are amazing. Now, if you own a Marshall, Vox, or Orange, well, we've also got a set of pretty highly sought after tubes. These are Mullards, made in England from the 50s to the 70s. If you're looking for that classic, iconic 70s tone, Mullards are what you want. There's also the Matsushita tubes, which were made in Japan during that same era, but are like a third the price. So, you know, if you don't want to fork out for the Mullards, there are other options. Here we go. Let's kick things off. Now, after listening to the Marshall clips back to back, to my ear, the stock tubes had more kind of bite and presence and just a more prominent kind of high range and upper mids. Just cuts through a mix like crazy. When we swapped in the vintage Mullards, well, all that crazy, you know, like strident and really prominent high end kind of got softened off a little bit. Much more warmer sounding tube in the high end, and the mids became more prominent. So at least to my ear, that was the biggest difference. Maybe a slight difference in gain as well, like the stock tubes maybe a little bit more punch and push, and the vintage tubes a little bit more kind of forgiving in the attack area of the note anyway. So those are my final thoughts on the tubes. So as I said earlier, this is a comparison I've wanted to do for a long time. So huge thanks to the guys from Fuzz Audio. I will link to them in the video description below. All my gear, t-shirt store, tab store, the gear I use, all of that stuff is listed down there. Other than that, have yourself a great day.